All right, let's get started. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining this webinar on Seamless Access. It's great to have you all here, and I'm looking forward to a very interactive and engaging session. First, as a very practical matter, we will be recording today's session. So please do switch off your audio or video if you would not like to be recorded. So my name is Hielke Koers. I've had the pleasure to, and I have the pleasure to host the session today. For those of you who I have not met yet, I've recently joined STM as the CIO for STM Solutions, which is the new operational arm of the STM Association. I've used the last few weeks to orient myself, and I've had many introductory meetings with STM members, including some of you on the call today or some of the organizations that you represent. And one piece of feedback that I received on several occasions is that it's not always found to be easy for smaller or medium-sized publishers to engage with a project like Seamless Access. And that type of a barrier is a concern to me, because I think it's critical for the success of STM Solutions and perhaps of STM as a whole, that we do have that really broad base of participation and support of publishers of all shapes and sizes. So this webinar should be seen in that context, and it's the first of a series. We intended to be a series of webinars and workshops that we will be organizing with a view to enable low barrier and really interactive discussion and engagement, and really making sure that everybody's voice can be heard. There will be different levels of familiarity in the audience, so we'll start today with a brief introduction of Seamless Access, but also cover the roadmap and talk about a very nice recent adoption example. And at the end, we'd like to open the floor for general questions, general discussion, really make it a bit more interactive. And also to hear from you what topics might be of interest to organize future deep dive sessions on. One more thing before we kick it off. During the presentation, initially, we asked that you use the chat window to put any questions. We'll be collecting them and then pick those up at the end of the presentation and really open it up for a more interactive discussion at that point in time. So with that out of the way, thank you all very much again for joining. I look forward to today's session, and I'd like to hand it over to Heather Staines, who will kick off the presentation. Heather, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Hielke. I'm also really excited to be here and talk to you today. I will be joined by my colleague, Heather Flanagan. We'll do a little bit of Heather tag teaming throughout this presentation to cover the high points. So Hielke, if you can go to the next slide. So what we hope to do today, and as Hielke mentioned, we're particularly speaking to medium and smaller size publishers, is to tell you a little bit about the what and the why of Seamless Access, go over some terminology and some dependencies, talk about the experience so far and what we're looking forward to in the future, a little bit about the roadmap, and some hopefully interesting polling about future webinar topics for workshops, and we hope to leave time at the end for a discussion. We did run this session using Zoom meeting because we're hoping we can switch cameras on and actually speak with you during the Q&A. But as Hielke said, if you have questions while we're underway, don't hesitate to put them in the chat if you think you might forget. Next slide, please. So first up, why implement Seamless Access? So the third point first, Seamless Access reduces the number of times that a user needs to search for their institution when they are establishing and authenticating through federated access. Information about their institution or institutions is saved in the local browser, and we work with trusted service providers who can access that institutional data, and we'll show you what that looks like in the Seamless Access button. There's a couple of examples here of folks searching for their institutions. Next slide, please. Seamless Access is a coalition of 4 founding organizations: NISO, the STM Association, Internet2, and JAUNT. And these organizations thought it was very important that this effort be community-driven in support of researchers accessing different types of resources, tools through a shared infrastructure. Next slide, please. So the goals for Seamless Access are as to improve the user experience, and particularly important now during COVID when more folks find themselves off campus than ever before. So it's been very interesting to work on Seamless Access during this time. We want to enable continued identity federation infrastructure and standards. And we also want to be able to improve campus response to security incidents that can happen around individual usernames and passwords, and then limit the site-wide disruption that can sometimes result from abuse by individuals, for example, platforms identifying unusual or robotic activity. Next slide, please. So as the name implies, seamless access makes it more seamless. This is the recent example that Hilke referred to, which is the Institute of Physics publishing. So you can see this is an abstract page that a user has navigated to, and towards the bottom there on the left, the blue button is the seamless access button, which we'll zoom in on the next slide. So this is what the seamless access button appears when a user is not yet been authenticated through their institution, through the participating service providers connected to seamless access. So this seamless access button in many cases replaces what might have been a shibboleth or an Athens button, and it's shown there alongside other access options that a user might see, for example, rights find there and article galaxy. The next screen shows then what it looks like if a user is already authenticated somewhere. This suggestion here, New Jersey Institute of Technology, appears right there on the button. You'll notice just beneath the button, there's an add or change institution. We do know that there are many researchers who have multiple affiliations, and they may have different access pathways that they're using, as part of their research. So it's important if that institution that's displayed there is not the way that they would normally obtain access to a resource, that they have the opportunity to augment that. Okay, next slide, please. So seamless access makes it more seamless. We've gotten recent data from IOP Publishing, which has covered the period since early 2021 when they implemented seamless access up through, I think this was through April timeframe, and they saw an 82% increase in usage of federated authentication on the platform. And I noticed we do have Matthew joining us today. So if there are more detailed questions, or if you want to drill down more in terms of different regions, we can do that later in the Q&A period. Next slide, please. I'm going to hand over to Heather Flanagan for this one.
Excellent. So one of the things about any software product, of course, is people have different use cases. They have different reasons that they want to use it, different circumstances in which it needs to be expressed. So Seamless Access has broken that down into 3 different ways that you could actually integrate and implement Seamless Access into your platform. The first one is called the limited integration. If you've ever used a wiki like Confluence, you'll know that there's a login button that you don't have any control over what it looks like. It's going to say login, it's going to be in the upper right-hand corner, and that's all your choice. You can put your own discovery service behind that, but you're limited in what you can do. And this is Seamless Access's opportunity to help with that, because we can help with the discovery component that goes behind that when you can't actually control the button. A standard integration does let you use the Seamless Access service to display the button, and also uses the Seamless Access hosted discovery service behind the scenes. So in terms of integrating where you get the full experience, this is probably the easiest one for a publisher to do. And that said, a lot of publishers have requirements when it comes to what do they actually want in the discovery list, how much control do they want to have over all of that. If they want a lot of control, then they're going to go with an advanced integration option, at which point we provide an API, which lets you point to just use that persistent service. It just looks at browser local storage to get the selection of your last IDP that you chose. And then the discovery component, that's all hosted on the advanced integrator side. We focus our development efforts largely on standard, such that we know the more people, the more organizations that use this, the easier and yet feature rich we want it to be. And that's where a lot of that work is happening. It serves as the reference implementation for just about everything else that we do. So you'll hear us come back to talking about limited integrations, standard integrations, advanced integrations. That's what we're talking about. Next
Thanks,
slide,
Beth.
please.
Just wanted to give you a brief update on the publishers who are currently live with their integration. The newer ones for 2021, American Institute of Physics, which went live on March 31st, and Institute of Physics, which is a little bit earlier, which we were showing, and we've got some publishers who are on deck who may be joining us today. Once you're in the implementation group, we have been hosting some workshops that you can participate in. And so we're happy to tell you a little bit more about those. But you can see there's quite a number of large publishers. I'll draw attention to the fact that the Add-upon platform has done the work for Seamless Access, and the other platform hosts, which you might be familiar with, are scheduled for later in 2021. Next slide, please. So there's a few dependencies for Seamless Access to work. From the researcher side, the institution must have SAML service, and the library must request that SAML be enabled on the publisher platform. In turn, on the publisher side, your platform needs to have SAML enabled, and you need to be working with Seamless Access. The user must authenticate through SAML on a Seamless Access enabled publisher platform. And if the user is using the same browser on the same device, Seamless Access will work across all the enabled platforms. And then I saw this as an extra bullet point that remained on here before. So ignore that last user authenticate points. It's not necessary. Next slide. Back to Heather Flanagan.
So at this point, Seamless Access has been in production now on various sites for over a year. And one of the reasons it's considered a beta service is because we knew when we first went live that there was still stuff we needed to actually have runtime to understand whether our ideas that we had in theory worked in practice. So over the last 18 months or so, we've learned a couple of additional things about how a user experiences federated authentication and Seamless Access. The first one is that the more options a user has in terms of, you can click here for federated access, or you can click here for buying, or you can click here if you're a society member, or you can click here if you are some other person. The more options you give them, the more confused they are about their next step. The second point, where you put the button on the page really does matter. Now, what we call above the fold, which is beautifully archaic for a web page consideration, above the fold is priceless real estate when it comes to presenting something to the user. And of course, this shouldn't be particularly surprising. That means, if you put the button above the fold, it actually has a better impact than if you put it below the fold. Details about the language around the button, such as, how do you tell the user that they can, if the institution that's in there is not what they want for whatever reason, perhaps they have more than one affiliation, how do you tell them that they can change that? How do you tell them that it's up to them as to whether, they agree that we can save that piece of information in browser local storage? The details on that language matter. And the more we can make it consistent across the board, across everybody that's using Seamless Access, the better off the user experience is. The fourth thing is that the whole experience does, including the discovery component, really does matter in terms of how a user is going to be able to follow the flow. If you make different pieces look very, very different from each other, then the benefit of a seamless access being something that becomes a consistent, users learn what to expect regardless of what site they're on, becomes challenging. I would draw your attention to, if you go to the SeamlessAccess.org website and click on documentation, you're going to be taken to our wiki. And in that wiki, you will have access to all of the guidance that we have, all of the material that we've determined is best practice for this. And also at the very bottom of the table of contents, essentially, is the user research section. We did a really interesting click test that helped us determine some of these things, such as, does it really matter where the button is placed and how many options there are, things like that. And there's some recordings of the users as they talk through what are they trying to do, what are they experiencing. And that, I think, can be an extraordinarily powerful piece of material as your UX teams determine what do you do next. Next slide, please. So Seamless Access has, from a technical perspective, touches on one little tiny piece of the federated authentication workflow. We don't actually do authentication ourselves. That happens at the institution. What we do is we make that discovery piece, that identity provider discovery piece, so much easier than it has been in the past. That said, because we're enabling federated identity, we have a vested interest, I guess I would say, in making sure that it's as easy to use as possible, that we are a part of solving some of the ongoing challenges that federated identity management has today. And so we have several working groups that step in and say, okay, we now have to live in this space. Can we convene the right people to help solve some of the challenges that we have? One of those working groups is called the WAIF Entry Disambiguation Working Group, which is pretty much a big old mouthful. What that group is trying to address is there are situations where an institution may have what look like more than one identity provider. From the user's perspective, they're being presented with two things that look exactly the same. However, they're not exactly the same. One might be the Open Athens IDP that the library has signed up with, and then the other might be the campus IDP that belongs in a different federation. There are a lot of reasons why this could happen, and there are a lot of good reasons why this could happen. Open Athens offers some very powerful tools to a library when they're trying to integrate with platforms that don't otherwise do federated authentication. The campus IDP has to support all of the campus use cases, the library being just one. So they're not always as responsive to a library as one might otherwise hope. So what do you do? What's the best way to disambiguate those two identity providers in a list of an IDP discovery service? We have no idea. And that's why we have a working group, so that we can sit down, bringing together librarians, publishers, federation operators, campus IDP providers, and say, here's the challenge. What can we do? What are some good practices in this space? The next working group that's active right now is the contract language working group. A lot of publisher contracts still refer to IP authorization. They may actually explicitly exclude federated identity. We're trying to help put together a template of language that we could, well, not us, but that the librarians and the publishers could then use to say, federated identity is okay, but here's what you're allowed to ask for, such that the librarians understand it, their campus IDP understands it, the publisher understands it. They may be able to only do authentication and that's it, or it may be authentication plus entitlement, but that's something that will go into these kinds of templates to make this a bit more consistent, a bit less expensive for everybody involved in terms of time and effort to figure out what to say and what they need to ask for. We have an outreach committee. The outreach committee does exactly what it sounds like. It focuses on educating the library and publisher communities in particular about the uses of federated identity as well as the uses of seamless access. And they put together things like use cases to help people read about, well, how have other groups solved this? What have the challenges been? They also put together videos, you know, the 5 to 10-minute videos to say, okay, so what's wrong with IP authorization? They have a short video on that. What does federated identity actually do? I think there's a video on that too. All of that's linked to on our website. Next slide, please. Okay, so we look a lot like, you know, a duck in that we are gliding across the top of the water, and underneath our legs are going just about as fast as they can go. We have several things on our roadmap at this point that we are working towards. There are user experience improvement that will be built into our standard integration and be offered as best practice guidance for advanced implementers. Those UX improvements include things like how do you make it immediately visible and accessible for people who don't use visual cues when an IDP is probably going to work or probably isn't going to work because perhaps they're not registered with that particular publisher. There are ways to signal this, and we're working towards, well, how do you actually do that? There's a lot of moving parts to it. There's internationalization components where we are determining what's the best way to allow a publisher to change the language on the button or change the language around the button to match if they are, you know, a Swedish use case. What does that actually look like? And can we put all the material in Swedish for the user? There is more on the IDP filtering. There's more on notification. There's also, and this is a big one for me personally, understanding how browser changes are going to impact federated identity services. You've probably seen on the news where they talk about Apple and Facebook and Google, they're tracking users. Tracking users is bad. How are they doing it? Well, there's a couple different ways. One way is through the use of cookies, a particular kind of cookie. Another way is through changing the URL, something called link decoration. The problem from our perspective isn't tracking, it's that federated identity uses the same primitives that ad tracking networks use because those are the only tools that were in the toolbox. So when a web browser says, all right, we are doing away with this kind of cookie, or we are doing away with this kind of link decoration, federated identity doesn't work very well. This isn't going to impact just academia. This impacts single sign-on if you are in an enterprise workplace, for example, or really it's more than just the consumers and Facebooks of the world. This has impact on a lot of other things. So that will impact seamless access. And we are trying to figure out, well, then what do we do to keep our user experience as good as it can be given the tools that we have available? And I think I hand it over to Hilke from here.
Thank you very much, Heather and Heather. That was great. So we'd like to explore with you what could be good topics for the next webinar or next workshop. But maybe before we do that, and we actually have a poll on standby, before we do that, let's open it up for questions and discussions or any feedback. So I invite people in the audience who have a question or a remark to unmute and share that with us. That means either everything was really very clear or things were not clear at all. Could I get the general view from people? Was this helpful as an overview to get a sense of where we stand and where we are heading towards? I see a couple of people on the call who are usually not shy, so do speak up. If not, if I may, I have a question. I'm wondering if I see some colleagues from Institute of Physics also joining the call. Would you be perhaps willing to add a little bit more context on that data point that we saw and how Seamless Access has increased the number of users that is benefiting from federated identity or federated authentication, I should say? Maybe I think I saw Matthew there.
Hi, Hilke. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you. So, yeah, allow me to provide a little bit more context. That number, I think, was 82% increase. So we use Open Athens. They are our supplier in terms of supporting federated authentication, and they provide us with a dashboard that allows us to understand the volume of logins that come via that particular authentication method. So originally we were looking at sort of analyzing impact based on the volume of logins, but we had some sort of challenges getting a sort of an understanding on the sort of geographical aspect. So we decided what we could do is usage. So look at total item requests, usage being, for most publishers, it's their currency. And I felt that way it would allow us to sort of understand from a geographical perspective, to basically just get a better sort of context on what's happened, but also try to allow us to understand how much of an increase in usage is happening within specific regions. So the measurement that we're looking at here is it's counter-aligned, it's total item requests, successful requests, or what's known as sort of downloads. And essentially, what we saw is if we just compared usage in 2021, important because if we look at what's happened in 2020, because of the pandemic, we saw such a spike of activity, such an increase in the number of institutions adopting that. We were concerned that any understanding of impact by the volume of institutions actually taking up that authentication method on our content platform. So 2021 felt like a sort of better data set to work with in terms of understanding impact. Actually, what we did is we analyzed from the 1st of January up until the 14th of March, when we implemented Seamless Access on our content platform, with the 15th of March to around the sort of start of May. And essentially, we saw an 82% increase in the number of total item requests coming via that specific authentication method. And then we started to analyze that geographically. If we looked at, say, the US, where federated authentication has very much become far more pronounced in its use, we saw 176%. So it really it was a demonstration of the dramatic increase and the attractiveness of that particular authentication method on our content platform. It was a real demonstration by making the changes that the benefits that we've implemented through Seamless Access. It's clearly having an impact on the way users navigate and access our publisher resource.
Great, thanks for sharing. And again, just to reconfirm my understanding, this data point here, that's really the time just before implementing Seamless Access and just thereafter. So I'm not convoluted by this bigger long-term trend about people changing their authentication habits because of the pandemic.
That's exactly it. That's exactly it, Hilke. Yeah, I think we compare 1st of January 2020 to the 14th and then post implementation, which was the 15th of March.
Great, thanks. Very compelling.
Thank you.
Any questions or comments about this from other people in the audience? All right, then let's move towards the poll. So for me, right, my hope is that this is the beginning of sort of an ongoing way to allow people to engage with the project in sort of an informal, low barrier way. We had a couple of ideas of topics where we could do a deep dive on. This was still the introduction and then sharing some recent findings and pulling back the curtains a bit to share what we are thinking about and what's happening. We had a couple of thoughts where we could do a deeper dive into some particular areas. They're listed over here. And we've prepared a poll. So Joe, can I ask you to start the Zoom poll? And then what I'd like to ask you is indicate if these are topics that you would be interested in attending a follow-up webinar or a follow-up workshop on. And if you have other topics that you would rather spend time on and engage with, then please put them in the chat. They're very welcome as well. And if you feel like, well, this is actually fine, right? For me, no need for a follow-up webinar, then also do tell us, because we're really doing this to facilitate the dialogue. All right, I see some numbers coming in.
You know, Hilke, I know I had a question about what seamless access for authors meant. Others might as well. Do you want to explain that one a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So also this came out of some of the conversations I've had with publishers recently. Several indicated some interest to explore if seamless access could also help with authentication in editorial and authoring systems. So if you're submitting your manuscript as an author, or you need to log in as a reviewer or as an editor, just to explore that space a bit and see if seamless access could also help facilitate those user journeys. I think traditionally the focus has perhaps been more on connecting to the reader side and a publishing platform, so this would complement that. All right, I think most people have cast their votes. Any other topics that people would like to explore? If so, please put them in the chat. Let's see if I pull this to this screen. Can people see the outcome of the poll on the screen as well, or is Zoom blocking that out?
What happens if you say share results?
Ah.
There you go.
Oh. Share results, there we go. Can people see the results as well?
Yep.
Excellent. So number one, the librarian perspective. Can I maybe invite people who cast their vote for the librarian perspective to elaborate a little bit what you have in mind and what you'd like to get out of that? There are 7 of you, so is anyone willing to elaborate a little bit, just to make sure that we have our own understanding, I guess, of what this would mean, but what you would like to get out of it, such that we can invite the right people and choose the right format, etc. Anyone?
I'll say something. Yeah, I'm just wondering, what is the how strong is the desire by librarians for publishers to integrate seamless access?
Okay. Yeah, that's a great topic, I think, to tease out in a bit more detail. Is that also what others would like to get out of it, or do you have perhaps additional things that you'd like to discuss in such a session?
Hi Hilke. Yeah, there's another thing that I'd like to sort of understand, which is the concerns, I guess. We as a publisher have done a number of outreach campaigns to specific regions to sort of help promote federated authentication, and it's been really interesting at getting the sort of polarized perspectives. So I'm keen to understand some of the levels of apprehension and concerns around federated authentication and seamless access as well.
Yeah. And that would also flow into a session on the librarian perspective, I imagine, right, Matthew? Or would you want to do that as a separate session?
No, I think as part of the librarian, that's exactly it. Yeah.
Great, thank you. All right, moving on. I see number 2 is a UX deep dive. And we also have Serena Rosenham on the call, who has done a lot of great work on the UX. Anybody? Could I ask people who cast their vote on the UX deep dive to also elaborate a little bit on what they would like to get out of that, or what they would like to contribute?
Hi, I'm Beata from Cambridge University Press. From my perspective, I think it would be good to understand, like best practices, because obviously, our sites have their own kind of like style, but at the same time, to be able for users to authenticate much easier. The whole point is that publishers use seamless access and that button is recognizable. So just to understand like best practices maybe.
Yeah, great. So best practices and sort of the dynamics between the seamless access branding and perhaps your own branding as a publisher.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, great. I think that's a topic that we'd love to tease out in a bit more detail. Thank you. Anyone else who wishes to give a bit more flavor to this? All right, if not, let's do one more. I won't go through the entire list, but let's do one more. Security. Anybody who cast their vote for security would like to elaborate?
Yeah, hello. So there was a rumor recently around some vulnerabilities which were exploited, I think, on the SolarWind attack. So someone made the argument actually that federated access is inherently insecure with respect to that. So it would be nice actually to understand more around that.
Yeah, great. That's a very important topic, Piotr. So let's do that as a session as well. But in addition, I wanted to say that we're also preparing a post on the Scholarly Kitchen, which is likely to come out this week, to address some of those concerns that were raised. All right. Anybody else on security or one of the other topics? All right. So if not, then I think we can work towards closing this. This is what we wanted to share with you today and what we wanted to discuss in terms of next steps. To make it a bit more tangible, with the Seamless Access team, we'll take these inputs at heart, and we'll schedule a series of follow-up webinars or workshops. I think we'll just start from the top and see how things go. Maybe in about 6 weeks, 2 months, that's sort of the time scale that I had in mind. We can review a bit how that falls also with everybody's holiday schedules, of course. But we'll start to kick off the series starting from the top. We hope on your engagement and participation, and of course that of your colleagues and others as well. So to be continued, I think is the point where we can close for today. Thank you all very much. I hope this was useful, that you've got a bit of a sense about where we stand today, and also how we can continue the conversation going forward. Thank you all very much.